Hello, everyone. Welcome back. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you stand, to this Global Forest Summit that is co-organized by Reforestation and the Open Diplomacy Institute under the high patronage of Mr. Emmanuel Macron, President of the French Republic. We are here today to address, in this last topical session, the key issue of the economy of the forest, which is a very difficult question because this is how we will achieve the whole goals we've been laying out today: protecting forest, restoring forest, conservation of nature, as we know that 1 million hectares are at immediate risk according to the to UNEP, as 10 million hectares of forest, like the surface of Ireland, have been lost last year because of deforestation. This is key to find an economic policy that makes it possible and sustainable to achieve the goals we've been discussing the whole day. To address this question, I have the great pleasure to host different speakers. I'd like first to say hello to Leon Jorge Castaños. Leon, you're the Director General of the National Commission on Forest in Mexico, and you also have the honor to chair the Committee on Forest of the FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization. Hello, Leon. I do also have the pleasure to welcome Garo Batmanian, the Global Forest Lead, Landscapes and Biodiversity of the World Bank. Hello, Garo. And we have, from the opposite of the world, Dr. Robert Nasi from CIFOR, where you're the Director General of CIFOR. You're based in Indonesia. It's already quite late for you. Thank you for being still up with us today. And we also have Clarisse Magnan-Malaise, je devrais prononcer en français. You're the Senior Partner of McKinsey, where you are the Global Lead for Circular Economy. Thanks for being with us here in Paris. And from Canada, back over the ocean, we have the pleasure to host Terry Hutton. Terry, welcome. You're the Director General of the Canadian Forest Service. Thank you for being with us. Before we enter the conversation with this fantastic panel, I do have the great pleasure to host our last keynote speaker, which I had the honor to meet at the Paris Peace Forum in 2018, Hindu Umaru Ibrahim. She's the founder of AFPAD. She's been fighting for indigenous community for years, and she's very keen on forest protection and restoration. Hindu, thank you so much for being with us today. I'd like to ask you, could you have a 10-minute free speech to let us know on the way, from your community perspective, you envision a sustainable economy for forests. The floor is all yours, Hindu.
Thank you very much, Thomas, and hi, everyone. Firstly, I'm very pleased to be here for these important discussions on forest and economy. Of course, with the COVID-19 pandemic, and we know it is time or ever, forest is very important in our life. And for indigenous peoples, it has been, since many years, a center of what we are doing, a center of our life, a restoration of the nature, protection of the ecosystem, and building our economy are based in our nature. And that means our forests. So I believe those solutions are very essential for the sustainable features for all of us. Thomas, maybe people will ask, how do I know that? And why I'm always talking and advocating for that. It's simple because I am an indigenous person. I am coming from a pastoral communities who are nomadic, who are living from all the center of Chad to around Lake Chad and over to the Congo Basin, where it is part of our life, the tropical forest. So for us, our cattle is always following the rainfall, following the nature base where we have all our ecosystem in restoring. We are following the forest where the forest is not only the economy for us, but it is our pharmacy. It is our supermarket where we can find food. It is our school where we can building and founding our knowledge. So that's why we know how to live in harmony with our nature. For us, there is no difference between environment and life. We cannot talk human beings separately and forest separately or other ecosystems separately. No, we are depending of the nature. We are connecting with the nature. And that's what I say, we are also a nature because it is our culture. It is our identity. It is our way of living. There is no pathway to save our climate that does not involve a significant expansion of indigenous people's solutions. And the indigenous people's traditional knowledge are always built from the observation of the nature, way of living in our forests. And that's how when you go to the indigenous place in Amazon or to Indonesia or to the Congo Basin, in all around the tropical forest, you can see the most diverse ecosystem. It's the indigenous people's land. It is most diverse than a natural park, even when you have a guard are protecting it, because we know how to keep balance in our ecosystem. According to the UN Biodiversity, of course, the IPBES, who is the scientific expert body, they say the vital role that the forest is playing is estimated to 37% that can reduce the emission. And we also know this is part of the solutions to the climate change adaptation and mitigation. Indigenous peoples, who are only 5% of the world populations, we are protecting 80% of the world biodiversity. And around this biodiversity, our forest is playing a big role on it. That's how we can also consider the world economy. Because if we wanted to boost the economy, we need to consider the 80% of the protection of this economy. The people who are protecting it, they are contributing, not only by valuing money, but by valuing the protection of the nature. For the tropical forest countries, nature climate solutions can provide an innovative approach to restart an economy and to start a new generation of how we can build a sustainable economy for all the peoples. And that's also how indigenous peoples are doing this life. As measure of for all our economy, so we have to get the package on how the pandemic now build the economy. We have to learn from what is happening, because all the big countries reboost the money, inject the money in the economy. So if we use this way by injecting money in our forests, I think we can have a more sustainable life. If we protect nature, nature protect us more. If we protect the health of the nature, we are protecting our own nature. So that's how we are seeing our ecosystem to contributing in our future. All the climate solutions, it is also a new way to create a job, because we cannot talk about economy without talking about job. And I know what I'm talking about it, because when you come in the Sahel regions, you have 70% of the population depending from the rainfall, because they are farmers, they are pastoralists, or they are fishermen. So if we wanted to have a new job, we need to protect better this nature. And then the forests play a big role. Of course, for the private sector, it's obvious because they can get timber from it. They can have a big industrialized agriculture around the forest. But no, for us, we can move the economy with the small scale of how we can value the nature-based solution as indigenous peoples, local communities, and people who are depending from these forests are doing it. We can do that just by having the small project, scaling up. And one of the examples I can share with you, when we do the 3D participatory mapping, we can see how the tools can help the new innovation to scale up our economy. Lastly, it is true that the green recovery cannot leave anyone behind. it has to be included the communities and the various ecosystems that we are living on it. In the wake up of this COVID-19 pandemic, protected and conserved areas and the rights of indigenous peoples and of course, and the traditional knowledge must be in the heart of our future plan to build back better and restore more sustainable global economy. So we protect forests, we protect our economy, we protect forests, we protect our rights, and we sustain our future. So let us do it. I know that there are a wonderful panelists here who will take all what I said and turn it into how they are doing the concrete way in the communities. But just I wanted to warn you, do not forget the 80% of the biodiversity restoration is in the hand of indigenous peoples. So how the roles of the communities can play to protect our forests, to restore it, but to build better and sustainable economies for all of us in order to have a sustained life, fierce in equal and justice, in dignity of all the human beings. Thank you so much, Thomas, and really very good conference for all the people.
Thank you very much, Indu. You've been very loud and clear on the importance of embedding the indigenous communities in addressing this question. That is something we've tried to do the whole day with Chief Ninawa, with Apollinaire Usu-Leo, with Joe Puri, also very keen on the issue, with you, with Louise Mabulot. This is something we have at heart of our conference. And to keep discussing this aspect, I'll start with some sort of backgrounder to make sure we have the level of understanding of what is at stake from an economic point of view about forest protection and restoration. There has been a classical approach since the Kyoto Protocol that was meant to offset, to cap and trade carbon emissions. And in that sense, carbon pricing has been the whole driver of environmental policy. It is not being shifted a bit since we speak about the green recovery and getting way beyond this approach. But there is a lot to learn from this approach to understand its limits and to make sure we understand it very loud and clear on the way it can incentivize or can incentivize better forest expansion and biodiversity. And to speak about that, I'd like to turn to Terry Hatton from the Canadian Forest Service. You've been working a lot on this issue for many reasons. Canada is the second largest forest surface on the globe, with 9% of forest of the globe. Terry, could you tell us a bit more on the way you assess this carbon pricing approach that may have brought us to a dead end?
Thank you so much, Thomas. And I'd like to thank both the organizers, Reforest Action and Open Diplomacy Institute, for inviting Canada to this event. Before I begin, though, I would like to acknowledge that the land on which I'm speaking from here in Ottawa is the traditional territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. So thank you for that introduction, Thomas, and also thank you to our keynote speaker. You mentioned in terms of Canada's position on forest, we are quite fortunate and privileged when it comes to our forest cover. As you mentioned, we have 9% of the world's forest cover. 200 million hectares of our forest are under long-term forest management plans, and 164 million hectares are third-party certified as being sustainably managed, more than any other country in the world. The forest sector in Canada employs over 200,000 people, supporting 300 rural communities, and employs a greater proportion of Indigenous people than any other natural resource sector in Canada. So to get back to your question, what more can we do beyond carbon pricing to provide incentives for forest expansion and biodiversity? I'd also like to add, let's not forget about what else we can do to enhance these objectives within the existing forest landscape. In both of these cases, the first mechanism or key pillar is sustainable forest management. We recognize that sustainable forest management goes well beyond just managing for timber, but also carbon and other important ecological values. In Canada, we have transformed classical approaches to forest management over many, many decades by incorporating evidence-based decision-making on sustainability that also focuses on the health and the resilience of the forest. Secondly, Forest certification is also a key mechanism and is an added layer of assurance that forest products come from sustainably managed forest, as we have a robust science-based regulatory system as the basis of all forest management. And lastly, to go back beyond carbon pricing, we need to implement further measures to address ongoing environmental issues such as climate change, biodiversity loss, and land use change. As such, while Canada has set a price on carbon to reduce emissions to value carbon storage, such as in forests and soils, the Government of Canada is also implementing direct investments under the Growing Canada's Forest program. This aims to plant 2 billion additional trees over the next 10 years. This is an investment of $3.2 billion that will help Canada address climate change by expanding this natural asset that is our forests, thus increasing carbon sequestration. At the same time, it'll provide many other benefits, including supporting biodiversity through habitat restoration, contributing to human health and community well-being, as was mentioned by our keynote speaker. So to close, I also agree with our keynote speaker, a great point, that there is no path to net zero emissions that does not involve our forests, including sustainable forest products, which substitute more greenhouse gas emission substitutes for more greenhouse gas intensive alternatives. Forest-based solutions, bioproducts, and the bioeconomy are tools that Canada is deploying to reach net zero. Canada's plan to plant these 2 billion additional trees over the next 10 years is a great example of direct action that's required to expand our forests, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and to deliver other ecological benefits. Thank you, Thomas.
When I wanted to review this classical approach to forest economy issues, I did not only mean about carbon pricing, but I also meant about the fact that we still do not have any business model for forest restoration that remains grounded on development programs from public international aid. That is something I'd like to discuss with Robert Nassy from CIFOR. Robert, you're the head of CIFOR, and you've been looking specifically at this issue. Could you help us in reviewing this question and understanding what is at stake?
Thank you, Thomas, and good morning, evening, and afternoon for whoever is watching. I think it's a great timely event to organize. I hope that we will be able to have some follow-up. And in terms of your question about restoration and the business model, I mean, $6.3 trillion, that's the value of ecosystem services that we estimate to lose annually due to land and forest degradation. That's a mind-boggling number, and it's a rough estimate, but what matters is the order of magnitude. We are not speaking about millions or billions, but trillions. Just to put the number in context, this equals the value of the nominal GDP of France, Italy, and Canada together per annum. To achieve the bond challenge, we need about 350 billion, again, an estimate, but we know that 300 of these 350 billion are currently missing. And so we need to be found to address the problem. So to finance restoration at the scale needed, it must become an economic activity, creating jobs, improving livelihood, and of course, restoring forests. So if on the other side, achieving restoration at scale, like the bond challenge, brings unprecedented opportunities. If targeted investment in restoration are made, it could result in trillions in net benefits and a significant return on investment. Recent research shows that for every dollar invested in restoring degraded forests, you can expect a return to $7 or $30 in economic benefit. So we have a huge cost to society, the degradation continues. At the same time, we have a huge prospect of attractive returns of restoration. Still, we are not doing it. And the question is, why not? And I think our main problem, our biggest challenge is that we must change our paradigm about how, at what cost, and for what ultimate goal, and by whom restoration should be done. So we need to build a business model that moves from high to very high cost per hectare restored, with no financial return for the landowner, with environmental benefit only, perceived mostly of being not marketable, non-internalized, relying on public funding and top-down, into something where research and development and proper planning lower the cost, provide increased incomes, an industry that creates jobs, and the resulting natural capital provides goods and service to society that could be partially internalized, that feeds on blended finance and active participation of the private sector and local community, and is bottom up. So unless we do that, we are not going to achieve our goal of restoration. And we can say as much as we want, this is not going to happen.
That is something we will build on. Thank you, Robert, for being so clear. On top of the carbon pricing aspects and the business model of restoration to assess this classical approach to forest economy, there is one last item on our agenda that I'd like to cover with Leon Jorge Castaños, the chairman of the FAO Committee on Forest. Leon, you've been working also very closely on assessing the economic instruments for forest restoration and protection at a global scale, debt restoring for forest communities, subsidies, technical assistance. Could you help us understanding what is at stake here? What needs to be reviewed in those technical instruments?
I'm very honored to participate in this Global Forest Summit. I would say that in certain areas, forest owners and local communities have few incentives to conserve and restore forests, when the alternative incomes from a specific product such as meat, avocado, soy, palm oil, dairy products, illicit crops, among others, are higher than the income that they can obtain from the sale of timber and non-timber products. This situation, combined with a limited knowledge and awareness outside the forest environmental sector of the benefits provided by the forest ecosystems and the low value given to a specific ecosystem. Therefore, it's important to consider productive diversification based on ecosystems, agroforestry, and silvopastoral system. Forestry activities generate medium and long-term income, while subsistence agriculture and cattle generate short-term benefits. In this sense, public policy must reorient land use planning and simplify the regulatory framework. The challenge is not to compete with agribusiness value chains, but to articulate and harmonize sustainable development public policies and avoiding deforestation. Considering this situation, it's important to develop specific activities, source collective action, promote and integrate land management with institutions within the agricultural and environment sectors at the different levels of government in which policies or subsidies are aligned. This involves promoting interinstitutional and intersectoral coordination, which requires significant lobbying efforts and willpower to ensure that there is openness to articulate subsidies and incentives in rural areas. Likewise, it's necessary to work hand in hand with the private sector to encourage responsible agriculture production models with deforestation-free supply chain certification. This must be supported by the corresponding education and awareness of the importance of consuming these products. Design multi-year subsidy schemes in the initial stage, which allow paying for all the necessary activities for the restoration to be successful. Regarding criteria for the exportation of agriculture products, a requirement should be added to verify that they don't come from deforested territories. In Mexico, we are undertaking efforts with the Ministry of Agriculture in terms of avocado exportation to the USA. In the context of the pandemic, Mexico National Forestry Commission has been undertaking several actions such as forest communities are being supported for the restructuring of their debts with Mexico development banks. In addition, subsidies have been granted for working capital, equity capital, and the contribution of applicants to investment projects has been reduced. And also, an environmental service payment program continues to be advanced through various alternatives such as subsidies, as well as private, subnational, federal, joint funds. Thank you.
Thank you, Leon. I'm very interested in digging into the subsidy aspect that you've raised, just as Terry did. When we hosted Lord Zach Goldsmith this morning, the Minister of State for the Environment of the UK government, he's been insisting a lot on this aspect, that the money spent in subsidizing businesses that deforest is the exact amount of money that we would need to restore forests. That is also the point that Robert Nassi made earlier. So I'm very curious on the way we could tweak financial incentives and fiscal incentives to make sure that we articulate our objectives of fighting against deforestation, forest protection with the rest of our economic policy. And therefore, I'd like to turn to Garo Batmanian from the World Bank. Garo, can you hear me correctly?
Yes, I can hear. Thank you, Thomas. Thank you for inviting me for this important event. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, my fellow panel colleagues and all of those following this event online.
I'd like to ask you, we've been speaking about this the whole day. At the end of the day, it's all about articulating different landscape policies, incentives for agriculture, incentives for forest protection, for forest restoration, or for reforestation in a holistic approach. According to your work at the World Bank, what are the best means to articulate those different objectives?
I mean, you ask a very important question, and the reason we articulate this is getting away from the single sector. But we have to first start we have to first start recognizing that forest conservation and forest management are types of land use as much as agriculture is. People think that they're going to replace forest, which is nothing, with agriculture. That is a problem. Forest management and forest is a choice, is a land use, like Robert and others were saying, and Terry was saying, is economic value, Leon was explaining. Therefore, the starting point of forest-related policy should be a holistic approach based on landscapes and trade-offs between the land uses, while also considering that some policies are not under the jurisdiction of the forest organizations. This is very important. We put too much in the back of the forest organizations. All effort in this area require a balancing act. The world population is expected to reach 10 billion by 2050, and several studies estimate that the world will need to produce approximately 50 to 80% more calories by then compared to 2010. The biggest challenge facing the global food system is to meet these needs in the face of climate change and from an increasingly stressed, several limited natural resource base. Unfortunately, in many countries, existing fiscal policies for non-forest land use sectors, in particular agriculture, can increase the incentives for deforestation. It is common to find policies to promote agriculture which unintentionally lead to deforestation. For example, there are countries which taxes unused forest land more heavily than the agricultural land. They see it as an opportunity cost. So if you have a farm, but you haven't cleared up the land, you pay higher taxes on that land. This provides, of course, an incentive for landowners to clear trees from their land. Another example are direct subsidies to produce certain commodities, even in marginal land, place that does not have a high productivity, but that makes that agriculture product artificially more economically attractive, even with when compared, let's say, with a well-managed forest, which has had good rates of return. This is a crucial aspect to consider. The landowner will usually look for the most profitable investment. And if the subsidies are artificially making the agriculture more economically attractive, they will select that type of land use over forest management. The alternative is for policymakers to take a multi-sectorial and integrated approach to designing fiscal policy, not sector by sector, but looking at the interaction between sectors and looking at trade-offs. There is evidence that reforming existing fiscal incentives is a low-cost option that can free up additional domestic revenues while accomplishing environmental goals in tandem with adopting agricultural practices that increase productivity in the areas already cleared. The World Bank recognizes this challenge and is doing a study on repurposing agriculture incentives, policies, and support systems to offer the opportunity for governments to continue targeting benefit to improve the life of small farmers, it was discussed earlier, while also promoting more sustainable practice, resilient production systems, and integrated landscape management approaches. The second set of policies that I would like to briefly cover today is related to forest production. Many countries have a single stampage fee, which approximate to a yield tax by levying a fixed charge of volume of wood extracted. The challenge here is that when the country does not differentiate timber sourced from legal land clearing from timber produced from forest management. Of course, the cost of clearing land is much lower than the cost of managing forests properly. However, the timber yield per hectare from cleared land is 5 times higher than compared from the timber yield from the forest management area. So the market price will get distorted, will be lower and distorted owing to the higher volume of cheaper timber originated from land clearing. One alternative will be to have a scalable stampage fee based on volume per hectare. This has been applied successfully in few countries. Another alternative could be to have fiscal incentives or taxes adjusted for different means of production. Fee-based, we call it fee-based, where if your forest is certified, you get a credit on your taxes. So there are other ways of doing this. In all cases, the goal is to promote sustainable management of forests. In closing, I would like to share with you that the World Bank will soon launch a publication that adds to ongoing work we are doing on how to better design and incorporate fiscal policy within the climate and sustainable development policy mix. This publication will show how various fiscal reforms, a couple of those I discussed today, can positively influence forest conservation while freeing up resources that can be used for national development.
Thank you very much, Gerald. It was very exhaustive and very complete to address this question of the financial and fiscal incentives. In designing this new approach to the economy of forests, we've been discussing about fiscal measures, but there are many other measures we've been also pinpointing the whole day, including commercial measures, trade, international trade issues. I know, Robert Nassi, you've been also working on the economy of forest with an outlook on global supply chains, which can route businesses into deforestation campaigns, and that therefore there is a lot of room also for improvement in suppressing perverse incentives. Could you tell us more a bit about this specific aspect?
That's a bit of a follow-up of what Garo said about that it's whole issue of what is called perverse subsidies. And if you look at what we need to resolve our issue of climate change, we need to reduce our greenhouse gases emission. The biggest emitter of greenhouse gases by far is not forestry, or the forestry and agriculture, it's fossil fuel. And if you look at the current scenario, fossil fuel are heavily subsidized. According to 2019 IMF report, subsidies amounted to $5.2 trillion in 2017, or about 6.5% of the global GDP for fossil fuel. And the largest subsidizers are China, United States, Russia, the European Union, and India. By comparison, the market size measured by revenue of the global oil and gas exploration is about 2.1 trillion. So you have subsidies which are higher than, in fact, the world global market value of the production industry. If you assume that fossil fuel subsidy did not exist, the situation will be global carbon emission lowered by an estimated 28%, air pollution related deaths reduced by 46%, and government revenue increased by 2.8 trillion. Then you have the case of agricultural subsidies. OECD report found that 54 countries studied provide about $700 billion in total support to the agricultural sector. This creates, on the other side, a lost revenue of 50 billion a year for developing countries, and by making unsustainable cropping system artificially viable. And don't misunderstand me, not all subsidies are bad, especially if they are well designed to support the poorest citizen and helping to lift them out of poverty. But in a lot of cases, the subsidies are counterproductive for what we want, which is well-established forest ecosystem, restore land, and a sustainable economy. And the removal of subsidy for fossil fuel, bioenergy, agriculture will be an immense boon for forest and the environment, if well thought through and rather invested into the circular bioeconomy. And you have examples like that. I mean, it's sort of, if you are in India, in Andhra Pradesh, you can choose to give $1 billion of subsidy for farmers to buy fertilizer and continue the problem of degradation and intensive, or you can give them $1 billion in subsidy in trying to develop agroecological systems that are sustainable and don't require as much fertilizer or pesticide. Similarly, if you are trying to remove invasive species in South Africa, you can either do something top-down like this, or you can do like the Working for Water program, where in fact people use high-intensity, low-skill workers to remove the invasive, train the worker, so it creates jobs, it creates economic activity, it removes the invasive species, and it doesn't create a perverse subsidy. So it is possible to remove perverse subsidy. We should reinvest, like Tim said earlier, and what we are investing now in fossil fuel into the circular bioeconomy, as presented by Mark in an earlier session. So I think we know what to do. The problem is that you have so much vested interest that we are not doing it.
I'd like to take it from here, from the bioeconomy approach that you just mentioned, Robert. Thank you. And turn to Clarice. You work at McKinsey, and McKinsey has published recently a well-known report called The Value of Conservation. And in this report, you clearly lay out different opportunities to invent more responsible, more sustainable agro-business models. And I'm curious on knowing, because that revolves around the question that we had with Robert earlier about the fact that it's very difficult to invent a business model for forest restoration. If we look at it from the perspective of your report, do you also see some room for improvement for another economic approach to forest here?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think we had lots of numbers being quoted so far. And I think the biggest challenge, I think, is to establish the business case of the conservation of value. And that's what we've tried to do. So we don't want to associate a price to nature, but for sure we want to measure the value of nature to humanity much better, right? In terms of livelihoods and in terms of economic prospects. So I think there are really value in this conservation that we can measure very, very concretely, because we talk about trillions of dollars, etc. It doesn't mean anything for a normal human being. But if you are in India and if you have a rise in temperature that prevents 160 to 200 million people from breathing and from working outdoor, that means something. And in economic terms, we talk about outdoor labor productivity going down, and we talk about 2.5 to 4.5 GDP loss for India. But concretely, it means people have difficulties working outdoor because it's too hot, right? So I think what we try to do is to bring to life the consequences of climate change in the economy of people in countries like India, like the United States, like Congo, and you name it. And to make a clearer linkage to agribusiness and food and agriculture more broadly, you know, 60% of the grain that are produced on the planet reside in 5 regions. 5 regions in the world make up for 60% of the grains. So it's rice, it's wheat, and so on. It's very basic food that we all eat, and it's a disproportionate amount of a human being diet. So if we have a climate change challenge, flooding or extreme drought, then potentially we have hunger issues on the planet. So basically we're trying to make a connection between climate change, physical risks, impact on economy, and therefore, what is the value of protecting forests? And honestly, forests are very cheap and low tech, and we can scale the avoidance of deforestation and the boosting of the reforestation at a pretty low cost, right? And this has been really assessed. So we have 10 countries where we know we need to avoid deforestation. So it's not a super complicated topic. We know the list of the 10 countries where we need to subsidize or find new business models to reduce the deforestation.
And Clarisse, to get it from here, this is quite a macroeconomic approach to it. I mean, in terms of GDP loss, in terms of economic price, because of social security needs, etc., etc. But if we zoom at a micro scale, if we look at the so-called generations of entrepreneurs for forestation that Stéphane has called for action this morning, do you think that in the framework of those figures, there is a business case possible, a business model that an entrepreneur can follow to make sure that it is a sustainable business on the ground to create jobs, to protect forests, to restore forests? Is there an opportunity there, a
Yes.
business opportunity?
And that's what makes me hopeful in a way, is that there is definitely opportunity to create value, and we've quantified this. And of course, ecotourism that is linked to well managing the conservation of nature, and agriculture, which we also need to protect, and we need to make sure the yield of agriculture is good enough to feed the population. So we've estimated quite a large number of direct jobs. We're talking about 400 to 650,000 jobs directly created by the conservation of nature, so direct jobs, and 30 million indirect jobs linked to ecotourism and fishing and agriculture. So we have job creations at stake. We have value. Other thing that we haven't discussed so far is in forest you also have co-benefits that have not been quantified so far, which are the chemical compounds, which are the pharmaceutical solutions. There is within forest also some wealth in a way, and a gift to nature, but that also translates into value creation and business opportunities if it is well managed and with a sense of the greater good, obviously.
That is something we've been discussing already about the so-called biodiversity-driven business models that we discussed with JPMS, with P&G this morning. But I'd like to zoom on the job market aspect and revolving back to Leon from FAO. Leon, you've been insisting quite a bit on the fact that it needs to be involving local communities. And indeed, we know that 40 to 60 million people work in the informal sector of forests on the ground all over the world. Do you see a way that international organizations like FAO or big firms like the one I quoted earlier can launch a movement of entrepreneurship to capture the value that Clarisse has just laid out, creating jobs on the ground within local communities? Do you see that?
In Mexico, a very important part of forest ecosystems and landscapes are of social property, and agricultural communities or indigenous or native peoples with local forms of organization for production, with biocultural management of their land and with contribution to the development of public policies with differentiated approaches. At Mexico National Forestry Commission, we value very highly and consider essential to have local communities as the main actors in the design and operation of programs. In this sense, we are seeking to transform the Commission into an institution that builds technical, organizational, commercial, and entrepreneurial capacities in local communities through a continuous dialogue and working hand in hand with them. In these efforts, it's vital to include women, indigenous people, and youth, as they are agents of change towards sustainable forest management. The Commission has several participant platforms in which forest communities, indigenous people, academia, private sector, NGOs, the federal government, including the National Institute for Women, and state council participate. The main one being the National Forestry Council, in which the Forest National Program, the subsidies, and planning documents are revised and approved. Undoubtedly, a new approach to the economy must be promoted. In the case of forests, focus it without neglecting the importance of participatory community territorial planning, in which cultural diversity and knowledge of the communities is recognized and valued. This in order to safeguard their physical, social, cultural, economic integrity, as well as to ensure a process of free, prior, and informed consent, and to provide them with culturally appropriate benefits. An experience in this sense has been a special project on forestry development in the northern zone of the state of Jalisco. The objective being to implement a collaborative work and develop an investment program in 2 out of the 63 indigenous communities in Mexico. This project is still in development, since the aim is that the local communities themselves, from their worldview and local community practices, design with the support of the 3 levels of government, the program's objectives and goal seeking to achieve a true collaborative work and the development of the project and a community ownership of forest development. I will add that in the case of Mexico, we are deficit in the production of pulp and paper. And we have very good experience in forest plantation, commercial forest plantation in the southeast of Mexico with private sector. And in the last 10 years, the experience that we have is that the private sector that have the capital can work together with the landowners that belong to the social communities. This is a challenge in Mexico, how to combine the private sector, the investment of the private sector with the forest owners. This is a permanent challenge, but we are finding new ways to approach this problem. Thank you.
Thank you, Leon. That is a very complete answer, and indeed it is a complex issue to articulate a global outlook on forest economy with very local approaches based on community-driven policies. That is something that builds up the new economic approach to forest management that I've been evoking so far, which revolves around new agriculture articulation with new agriculture fiscal policy, the suppression of perverse incentives along supply chains, seizing agribusiness model opportunities. But there is one last aspect I'd like to discuss with Terry. Terry, the Director General of Canadian Forest Service. We are here to discuss this topic of transforming our approach to forest management. And I'm asking, how can we ensure that we are managing our forests for more than just fiber? This is, I guess, the key question remaining on the plate.
Thank you so much, Thomas, for that question. And I'd like to start, and there's been a couple comments from our past speakers as well, is I'd like to start by saying that we cannot look at our forest landscape solely through the conservation lens. We really need to consider all of what healthy forests can offer our communities, as well as our Indigenous peoples who derive their livelihood from them. And the solutions that the forest and the derived wood products offer that can transition to a low carbon bioeconomy. And as I mentioned earlier, whether that's replacing more carbon intensive materials with wood, such as mass timber construction and buildings, bioplastics, bioheat, and bioenergy. In Canada, we have a program that is our green construction through wood. And in this program, we're really working to address climate change impacts, but also increasing Canadians' understanding of the role that forest products play, but not only in changing climate, but in a changing forest products sector. But that, having said that, there is an important balance that we have to strike on these landscapes, as they also offer other critical nature-based solutions, biodiversity, climate change mitigation, but also social benefits, such as spiritual values. There are efforts underway, and in Canada, to accelerate the circular bioeconomy. Canada has a forest bioeconomy framework that really sets the goals to become a world leader in the use of forest biomass for bioproducts and advanced innovation. But in order to do this, there are a couple things that we need to do. First and foremost, we need to support strategies in the forest sector that use circular designs to reduce waste, open up new market opportunities, such as turning pulp and paper mill waste into renewable bioproducts. And secondly, we need to support projects that will improve the traceability of the source materials, establish forest biorefineries, and enhance the reliability and the availability of feedstock supplies. Feedstock supplies is such an important part of the circular economy. But part of the sustainable circular economy is to ensure that the materials that are entering the systems were collected sustainably. Key to this is really helping companies better understand their global supply chains. On a related item, there are efforts to use things like blockchain and other logistic technologies to really bolster the certification approaches and enable reliable identification and traceability of sustainably harvested wood. Chain of custody is such an important element, as this would enhance the trust of consumers who are increasingly aware of environmental issues and demanding sustainable products. People want to ensure that their wood products did not contribute to deforestation. And here is where we see as a critical area for global cooperation. Thank you, Thomas.
Thank you, Terry. And looking beyond the classical approach on forest economy that we've reviewed together, and taking into account the different perspectives that we have to reinvent the forest economy, I feel, and that is something that we wanted to advocate for in this Global Forest Summit, that we are on the verge of a deeper paradigm shift in the forest economy as a whole. The term bioeconomy has been put forward in various speeches today. I'd like to break it down a bit to make sure we are on the same page of what it does mean. And first and foremost, I'd like to turn back to Clarisse to understand, based on the studies and reports that McKinsey has published, what it does mean clearly when we give a value to ecosystem services. You've been speaking about the natural capital. What it does mean clearly, and how do you assess its value? What is the methodology behind that, and what kind of figures you get out of those reports?
So I think what we tried to do is two things. Number one is to calculate the benefits And we haven't quantified all of them, but we try to do our very best. And the second is we also quantified the annual operating costs of making it happen, because it's obviously a cost benefit equation, right? So I think we talked about the GDP impact, the job descriptions, the job creation, the climate change, mitigation. We haven't talked about the zoonotic disease, which are also something that is going to sadly materialize, and we are experiencing the COVID-19, but frankly, we could have much more in the years to come, given the exposure to unexplored areas on the planet. And I think you mentioned also the role in the local economies with the indigenous communities and their survival and also the richness associated with their culture and their languages. So I think the key facts, I gave some of them. I think, honestly, from a GDP standpoint, the number that really makes a bit of consensus is the fact that nature-dependent markets represent $300 to $500 billion in GDP. So that is really, I would say, the golden number that I would love to convey. But one thing I wanted to emphasize, because I know we don't have a lot of time, is what can the institutions do about it? I mean, we talked a little bit about creating new business models and entrepreneurs and so on, but I think leading private sector institutions can have an impact on this. And frankly, there are three things that they need to do. Number one, they need to stop having a negative impact, and stopping having a negative impact on deforestation means that they need to map their supply chains, and in particular those of their suppliers, and really look at where they source from, what are the conditions by which they source ingredients, which can go into food, which can go into beauty, and many different types of products. That's number one, and they need to stop as much as they can the creation of external negative externalities. The number two is they need to offset when they don't have an alternative, or if they need to compensate, then they need to offset, and they need to offset the right way. So not only planting trees, but making sure we conserve a diversified ecosystem where we give back to local communities and they can set up projects, and there are great NGOs and entrepreneurs that can provide projects for them to offset. And the third thing is to contribute to the global solutions. The problem of our economic system is that we do not measure accurately the external, the negative externalities of businesses. This needs to be taken into account, and we also have many people working on this, usually using carbon as a very simple currency. And that's not perfect, but at least it can be measured, it can be audited. And therefore, we can look at what is the economic contribution of a company that is objective, that's the economic profit. And we can look at the negative externalities that this company is producing. And if we create the transparency on these negative externalities, then we can put a cost or a price associated with it. And this is how we are going to find the way to fund solutions to this global problem.
And Clarisse, I'd like to specifically zoom on this aspect, because this is one of the main criticisms that we've heard about the importance of developing another approach to this, because carbon price is so low today that it means nothing. So that this approach of giving a price to carbon doesn't bring us to achieve something that is up to the challenge that we face. How do you assess this? I mean, we can't launch a full discussion about carbon pricing, but still, this is the heart of the topic, isn't it?
Well, I agree that we need to sophisticate the assessment of the value of nature and the benefits, and also the risks and negative externalities, and we need to sophisticate this, and I'm sure this is going to come. So I agree, carbon is a bit simplistic in a way, but the beauty is, I think, the ability to compare. But even with a low carbon price or cost, there's already a lot of things that we're not doing, even with this level of carbon cost, right? So we know the cost per a ton of carbon sequestration from avoiding deforestation, and that's pretty, affordable. It's $28 a ton of carbon. This is what it costs, because it's not only the cost of carbon; it's the cost of financing the sequestration of nature, and we also know the cost of reforestation, which is actually cheaper, which is around $18. So we have the numbers to play with in a way, right? It's not only the cost of carbon, it's the cost of sequestration that we can use.
So it does mean that if we keep the carbon price as it is, reforestation is much cheaper than compensation, right?
I think out of all the levers to reduce our and to get on the 1.5 degree pathway, of all the levers, the cheapest and low technology and globally scalable is number one, avoiding deforestation. Number two, fostering reforestation. So
that is important. We keep it there as first and foremost. It's about conservation, protection of forests. That is the cheapest ever solution. And then restoration, which brings me back to Terry. Terry, we've been talking a lot about circular bioeconomy, but in this concept, there is something very interesting, is that there is an increased net gains for restored forest. Could you tell us a bit more about this?
Thank you, Thomas. And actually, I do want to bring us back, obviously, to the circular bioeconomy. I think that is a very important driver for the future as well, when it comes to benefits and when it comes to actions that people will incentivize themselves based upon what those opportunities are. So actually, I'm probably going to sound like a bit of a broken record, and I do apologize. But when joined together, we really see that sustainable forest management and that circular bioeconomy is really the opportunity to continue operating a sustainable resource sector. It supports the communities, while at the same time it values the nature-based solutions and the ecosystem services of our forests. I take a bit of a tangent here. Yesterday, March 11th, the world marked the 1-year anniversary of the World Health Organization's declaration of the COVID-19 pandemic. In Canada, a national day of observance to recognize the effects of the pandemic was declared. During this pandemic, I think we all gained a renewed appreciation for both nature and our resource workers. Around the world, parks and forested areas became increasingly popular as places where we could find some comfort from the effects of prolonged lockdowns. The forest industry itself was declared an essential service in numerous countries, including Canada, and contributed to the production of critical medical equipment such as gowns and masks. Now that the work has really begun to recover from the pandemic, like the opportunity at hand and to do so in ways that advance the transition to the low carbon, low waste economy in society. The advanced bioproducts, innovations, and sustainability of a circular and integrated forest industry is really a key part of the recovery. There are challenges. Challenges do remain in building the value chain, as was discussed earlier, in scaling up the solutions of the circular bioeconomy. Much more needs to be done to link those biomass suppliers with designers, manufacturers, end users, and investors. There are opportunities to build this connection through biorefineries and bioeconomy market clusters. Scaling up is also a big challenge. With bioproducts and other solutions, they require much more patient capital and product demonstration support. This is where the efforts by governments to implement new programs, update building codes, and make use of government procurement to bring viable solutions to market. And as a final point, there's a bit of a theme that I've been hearing not only through our speakers, but also our keynote speaker, is that through sustainable supply, of natural resources, along with efficient use of wood, valuing our residues, developing bioenergy infrastructure and new biomaterials, the transition to a circular bioeconomy will provide a wide range of benefits and drive those incentives as well. You'll have local and meaningful employment, new advancements in environmental technologies, opportunities for Indigenous peoples, and with proper sustainable forest management, certification, and material tracking, conservation, biodiversity, and fighting climate change, can also be achieved. Thank you, Thomas.
Thank you, Terry. I'd like to give the final word to Gero from the World Bank. We are entering the UN Decade for Ecosystems Restoration, which is meant to help us making it real, this new business model approaches a bigger picture of the forest economy. How do you look at it from the World Bank's perspective? Do you think there is a true economic potential? Have you also put some figures on this opportunity?
Yes, I do, Thomas. Thank you for the question. This has to be divided in two. The first part is that, as Terry mentioned and others have mentioned, especially in the case of restoration, nature-based solution tends to be the most economically viable option. It doesn't have to be paid for. It's, if you want to protect a coastal area, you may build a wall or you may plant a mangrove. If you want to protect the size of hills from landslide, you tend to plant forest. And those are cheaper options than other infrastructure interventions. So there are out there options of doing nature-based solutions. When we call it nature-based solutions, because if you don't think of nature, then you can go and plant on the hillside, but you don't plant local species that help biodiversity as well, etc., don't generate co-benefit. So that's what you have to think about, that in nature-based solution, it has to be something that is based on what the nature there was, and not, let's say, make a monoculture plantation of an exotic species. That wouldn't work. So that part is working. The second part that is working in a localized way is payment for environmental services. They have payment for environmental services in many countries, here in US, in Europe, in China, in Mexico, in Brazil. Here, backyard, farmers are paid not to plant, so it doesn't pollute the rivers, and it decreases siltation. That is something that is doable, is happening. It's happening in many countries, but it's kind of a small bit by piece work. So in the global sense, it's only going to work if everybody does that. What's the risk there is when the payment of environmental service is not a transaction, a private transaction between the supplier of the service and the beneficiary of the service. If this becomes payment for environmental service is a payment just the government pays out of the taxes, and it's not the water company paying for a better water supply, then becomes a problem, because 2 or 3 years from now, if this is not in the budget, there is a crisis like we have right now. The government can decide to cut that cost. So it has to be more aligned between who is benefiting from who is profiting. Those two, I think they are there. What's the potential is starting in after the CBD COP, Thomas, that I want to point it out is that the intergovernmental platform for biodiversity and ecosystem service has the merit of putting ecosystem service as part of the discussion on the CBD. In the past, when people were talking about the Convention on Biological Diversity, they were just talking about protected areas and species. All very important. I work on them all the time. But the addition of ecosystem services provided by the biodiversity and by nature, be it pollination, being water, being control of temperature, those things were not brought up to the forefront. And I hope that if the CBD comes to something more, depending on the decision CBD, we can start seeing a market for nature-based services on top or in addition or in parallel to the carbon market, because the carbon market doesn't differentiate a ton of carbon from Brazil from a ton of carbon from China, and that's right. Okay.
Thank you very much for reintroducing the very important aspect of having biodiversity in the scope of this economy of forest. That is a point we've made earlier, and it's important to recall it as we go towards not only COP26 in Glasgow for climate issues, but also to COP15 in Kunming. that is meant to reinvent the post-Aichi framework to deal with global governance of biodiversity. We need to wrap up the conversation from here. I would like to thank our panelists that have clearly responded to Hindu's point on the fact that there is a strong sense of emergency, not only to preserve jobs around the forests in indigenous communities and on the ground, but also to create new jobs that deliver not only an economic value, but a bigger environmental and social service. We will stop it here and resume in the next 10 minutes for the closing panel of this Global Forest Summit that is co-organized by Reforest Action and the Open Diplomacy Institute. Thank you very much.